Welcome. This is Sandra Hess, Executive Director of the Calaveras Winegrape Alliance, here today to talk about the history of Calaveras wine.
Okay, I'm Scott Klann with Newsome Harlow Wines. We've been operating since the year 2000. It's our 20th anniversary, and I've been making wine in Calaveras since 1992.
Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.
And I'm Kate Boyle-MacDonald. I am the owner and winemaker for Boyle MacDonald Wines, and I started in the industry in 1999.
Hey, my name is Bryan Clauson. I am the president of Klassen Wines, which is a wine marketing company. We've been doing that since 1990, and coinciding with the same time I started working for Barden Stephan as his national sales manager. I'm also one of the partners at Holley Winery on Main Street, and I've been doing that for the last 3 years.
Thank you. And so lots changed, since the mid-90s, early 2000s. People like Chuck Hovey, Barden Stephan, so many coming in with very entrepreneurial, pioneering spirits to the Calaveras Wine Region that we know today, with over 40 tasting rooms.
I met Barden in 1990, and he was as soon as you meet him, or as soon as you met him, you would recognize that he was such a visionary, and he had passion and vision, and those times in Calaveras County was really not that well known on the world wine scene. Our perspective was a little bit different because we were selling the wine outside of California, but it's an amazing amount of people that you would run across, both in the industry and just in the general public across the states, that know of the town of Murphy's. So that gave us a leg up, and anybody that's ever been to Murphy's had a very fond memory of that. It was easy to talk about the wines then because it had a significant point of difference, and that's what we're looking for in sales all the time, is a significant point of difference, whether it's the history, the legacy of winemaking, the climate, the elevation always seemed to be really important to the consumer. And so I remember those early days that we were sort of the odd duck, and that was a really odd, a real marketing opportunity, I thought. Anyway, that's what I think.
So what a wild ride for you, Bryan, to think about going out to a national audience and selling wines made from Murphy's, California. For the most part, that's what people, recognized, and talking about what Calaveras County meant. I mean, what were those conversations like?
I think a lot of it was, most of these people are, they want a story that's different about wine. So they were quite often as interested in the Mark Twain heritage and the Gold Rush heritage as they were in the historical legacy of winemaking in the area. I would be gazumped by Barden at every time we met in a common setting, because he'd simply pull out a little vial with a gold nugget in it, and then nobody wanted to talk to me anymore.
And I might ask, Bryan, what brought you to Calaveras County?
It was simply the job offer from Barden Stephan. I was working for an Australian company, and then through a roundabout way, I knew Tim Murphy of Murphy Good Wines up in Alexander Valley, and Tim was using a marketing agency that represented Barden's wines, amongst others such as Dry Creek, Preston, Alexander Valley Vineyards, and Murphy Good. And they introduced me to Barden, who was looking for a national sales manager. But at that time, Barden's interest was really in winemaking, but it was also, he was just starting the Greenhorn Creek project. So he was very interested in that. And the interview about the national sales position lasted less than an hour, and then he wanted to talk golf. So
Golf and fishing, I'm hearing. And so Kate and Scott, you're both notable winemakers from the Calaveras Wine Region and have done so much to really build this wine community. And I know at one point the two of you worked together. Can you share your stories about that?
Yeah, well, so I got into the industry in 1992, and I've been listening to the previous parts of this series that you've been doing, and there's a lot of great talk about Barden Stephan and the early days, and really there's no doubt that you can point to Barden and Stephan, Liz Milliere, Dave Olson, the Couts family, people like that, for really getting the ball rolling. And I remember when I got into the industry in '92, I had met Chuck Hovey just before harvest of '92, and we hit it off pretty well. And he offered me an opportunity to come help out for the harvest. And I remember that whole period of time. First of all, I fell in love with it on day one. I had no idea what wine was before that, and fell in love with it on day one. But aside from my own excitement about being in the industry at that point in time, was, over the first couple of years, you really did feel like this bit of energy starting to boil up. And none of that would have happened without the Milliers and the Olsons and the Couts family and Barden, getting the ball rolling. But I remember it being a time where that fever started to get contagious around the area. And also, and I should point out that Bryan Clauson was pretty instrumental in raising awareness of Calaveras, mainly because he was the guy that while Stephen O prior to that was distributed out of California somewhat, Bryan really took it to a national brand. So between Bryan and the Couts family, Calaveras was really starting to get some awareness in terms of winemaking. And I remember that feeling of, something's going on here. There's some bit of electricity. There's something to be paying attention to here. And man, it was freaking cool to be a part of it and know that I was a part of it. And I think what's really important to focus on kind of this second stage of Calaveras winemaking and wineries and the industry is guys like Bryan Clauson and Chuck Hovey, especially, who was so instrumental in not just in my career, but in Kate's and a few other people's career as well. Chuck really understood how important it was to train and bring in young people into the industry. And so while I was looking to guys like Barden and Steve and Dave and the Couts family and I remember looking at those guys with awe in just I'll use the PG term, but just the guts and the gall to build something where there was nothing. And it wasn't just Barden, it was Steve and Liz, and it was Dave and Jan Olson, it was the Couts family, and there was nothing here, and they had the guts to build something. And as a result of that, I was able to build my career and my business, and Kate as well. It was heady times, no doubt.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I was thinking about when you were talking about Barden and what influence he had on my career. It's, Barden was definitely a presence, but it was the same thing as Scott. Like, I just stood in awe of him and what he had developed. And what I found with Barden was that, he didn't just come here to start a business. He didn't just come here to start a wine business and be successful with that individual business. He came here to develop a community, and a community that people wanted to live in, and they wanted to stay here, and they wanted to raise their families here. And I feel like, Scott and myself very clearly are success stories for Barden as far as what his vision for this whole area is. We are a direct result of what Barden was looking for. He was looking for this area to grow and for people to come here and say, this is where we want to be all the time. And we want to raise our families here. We want to have our business here. We want to bring people here to share it with them. And so I take that as such an honor that I'm clearly a success story from what Barden's original vision was, before I was even born. So it's really an honor to be a part of that, for sure. It's definitely a history that I honestly didn't think so much about until Chuck Hovey passed. And in fact, Scott was the first person that I called when I found out after my husband. And I said, I think you're the only person who really understands like how impactful, Chuck was in our lives. Scott and I probably would not be here. We would not be winemakers. I don't think I'd be in the wine industry. It's possible, but it was all due to the fact that Barden built this foundation, and then he hired a person like Chuck Hovey who took it to the next level and just introduced us to this lifestyle that is just absolutely fantastic. And there are no limitations from the wine industry locally. So that's what I love about it.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely, and I would also add that it was part of it was the culture that that these guys created around their company, Barden and Chuck and Bryan. And those the 90s at Zinfandel Winery, and it was a party every day, whether we were harvesting or bottling or barreling. It was an electrifying group to be around. And I, again, as I mentioned earlier, I feel the same way about the county as a whole, but specifically down in that valley, it was all about creating a culture and a camaraderie where, everyone had their place there, and everyone was an important part of the team. And by extension, that, because Barden and Stephan Winery was so instrumental on the local, not just wine industry but tourism industry overall. Everybody had their part in the whole play. It was like there was all these different moving parts in Murphy's, and the vibe and the culture that the town still actually exemplifies was instigated by, for me, Barden and Bryan and Chuck and then the Meyers and the Olsons and the Couts family as well. And I shouldn't leave out the Thompson family, who were building and operating Indian Rock vineyards at the time. That was in those early days. But there was this whole vibe of, let's have some fun, let's be great, let's work hard, let's have the guts to build something and do something. And while that came from down at Stephenville, it was pervasive through Murphy's and the surrounding area. And as a result of that, coming out of that, it was the period where Stuart and Dolores Mast were planting the Bryce Station vineyard, and the Tanner family was planting their incredible vineyard on Highway 4, and Ian Renner was planting the Canterbury vineyard out on the Arolla Peninsula. And all these things were happening because there was a tone or a vibe of, yeah, listen, if you got the gumption, jump on board. Let's be part of this and let's do something cool. And nobody had to ask permission to get in. They just had to kind of carry that same frame of mind, and they were automatically in. And some really cool stuff happened in the 90s in Calaveras. It really exploded.
And I think about, Kate, this past summer, that I fell in love with your Sangiovese Bianco. I just thought that was such a beautiful wine, and I talk about it whenever I can, but just the creative approach that you took to making that wine from Calaveras County, I think, maybe there's some influence happening from Barden and from Chuck Hovey. So do you want to share with us your thoughts there?
Absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned that, because when I started at Stephenville, Barden had just acquired the Dragoni Vineyard, which is the adjacent property to the original Shaw Ranch, the Dragoni property, and he turned that hillside into vineyards. And so I was able to be a part of some of the first vintages that came off of that. And the amazing thing is, I didn't have any prior experience with wine. And so I understood there was Cabernet Sauvignon, there was Chardonnay, there was Merlot out there. But what I didn't know was that there were all these varietals that were so interesting. And Barden was, along with Chuck, agreeing what would be interesting to produce. he was planting things that were so obscure, that were not household names, and they were Albarino and Graziano and Tempranillo. Chuck, I mean, he really put Tempranillo on the map. So that was my basis, my foundation for winemaking is basically like the sky's the limit. There are no rules. You don't have to do anything according to a guidebook. And so that Sangiovese Bianco that you're mentioning, that's the exact spirit that I gained from Chuck and Barden in the plantings that they did. I too was like, I don't grow any white fruit, but I want to make a white wine. And so I'm going to make it out of a red Sangiovese grape or a red Cabernet Franc grape. I've done a lot of different whites out of different red grapes. And so that spirit has definitely been carried on, and you'll see it up and down the main street here in Murphy's. You won't recognize quite a few of the varietals, and I think that is the beauty of Calaveras County, and the fact that Barden and Chuck were willing to take that chance, that it wasn't just about the sales. It wasn't about selling a Cabernet Sauvignon that was tried and true. It was definitely about trying new things and getting people to branch out. And so you'll see that in Calaveras. I was so fortunate at Stephen. I think I worked with, gosh, I don't know, Brian, you'll maybe know better, but there were over 20 varietals there, maybe even over 30. And then within those varietals, we would plant different clones and all this stuff. So the possibilities were endless. And I feel like I've carried that on, and that was definitely from the being inspired by Chuck and Barden in that sense.
Yeah,
I think you see it up and down Main Street. I think you see, Tempranillo. Hubby focuses on Tempranillo, but everybody's focusing on these different things. And if you're a wine consumer or connoisseur and you come to Murphy's, you're taken aback by the variety of wines you can taste up here. I'm sure there's people that are my age and older that come to Murphy's just expect to take Zinfandel and the white version of Zinfandel and maybe some Chardonnay, but they're pleasantly surprised when they see all these varieties out there. Cinsault, Tempranillo, and I remember the story about all the varieties that we were planting at Dragoni, and I was a cheesy salesman. I just wanted everything to line up with what we were selling. So if it's up to me, I would have planted Merlot, Chardonnay, Cabernet, and Zinfandel in that order. But they planted these much more innovative grapes. And I remember questioning Barden. I said, Barden, is this the same kind of conditions that they grow in their native countries? And he goes, don't worry about that, Brian. It'll grow. So, they were visionaries, man.
And he was right. They did. And they're
absolutely.
And that's what really sets us apart. A lot of times people will come into our tasting rooms and they'll say, there's Zinfandel because you're part of the Sierra foothills. I mean, oftentimes a lot of us say we don't have a Zinfandel, but try, all these crazy obscure varietals that you can't even pronounce. So it's really a fun opportunity here.
Well, I would never say that we don't make Zinfandels because it's it. However, I agree with that sentiment a lot, and I think that we should double back and restate a very important fact that it wasn't just Barden and Chuck putting in these cool varietals. We'd be remiss if we didn't restate how much Chuck Hovey had to do with bringing Tempranillo into not just Calaveras, but California, into the States entirely. I mean, he was one of the absolute pioneers in these Spanish varietals. He got bit by the bug on these things, and he was very adamant about bringing them in. And I feel like Chuck was very much a part of finding out if these varietals did grow well in this area. And I don't think, in my opinion, that Tempranillo would have seen the resurgence in California, in Calaveras, let alone California, that we saw without Chuck actually, learning how to grow it, learning how to make it, really sinking his teeth into the varietal and pushing it like it was one of the most important passion points in his life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, thank you for that, Scott. And so, Brian, I think about you, we're talking mid 90s, early 2000s, and you putting Calaveras County on the map in many ways from a sales and marketing perspective, and going out there and sharing the good news. And to your point, it wasn't just let me share with you my book of the Cabernets and the Merlots and the Chardonnays. It was let me share with you 14 different varietals, coming from Calaveras County and such. And so, what was the conversation like? Consumers at that time, mid 90s, early 2000s, they weren't drinking as much wine as we are today. So I think that there's an exciting thing that happened at the time where you had this spirit of innovation happening in Calaveras County, and then consumers were like, yeah, there's a lot to learn about wine. So what was that like for you, Bryan?
Well, I think it was a two-edged sword, because some of the markets that I was dealing with, as an example, New York, we did a lot of business in New York. And when I was very excited at launching my Tempranillo, I would, come up against the old hurdle, which is always, well, I can buy wine from the Ribera del Duero for the same price. But so you have to, but that opened their eyes. At least they're familiar with the variety. And then when they try it, it's obviously more New World in style and less of an emphasis on age and oak. And they loved that we were doing stuff like that. So while I would probably walk out of Park Avenue Wine and Spirits with an order for our Stephen O. Merlot and our Cabernet and Chardonnay in 5 and 3 case drops, I would always walk away with a little bit of a sale of some Tempranillo, because it's just something interesting. And people in the wine business, they want to hear something interesting. So the story really, really helped. Barden's story helped. The elevation story helped. I got hung up on limestone for a couple of years about how we can grow Chardonnay in Calaveras County because of all the limestone. And Jan Olson used to like bust a gut laughing at me because she thinks it has absolutely no reasoning behind that. But that was always a good story, and stories are what this business is all about. And so, yeah, people were receptive. And I want to bring up something else about the generosity of spirit of everybody at that time. When I'd bring a customer out, or Steve Couts would bring a customer out from Iowa. Well, Steve would bring them from Iowa. I'd bring them from Manhattan. But, when we would bring customers to Murphy's, we would take them to all the wineries. We would, they were our customer, but we'd take them to all the wineries around us. And, we would share them and say, hey, here's a distributor from Manhattan, and he sells our wine, and we'd love you. We took him to, well, it's a good example was Scott was at Chatham then, and we hooked Chatham up with a distributor to this day in New York that is fantastic, called T. Edward Wines, and one of the best wine distributors in New York. Their business model was formulated in a week, staying at Barden's house on San Domingo Road. They came out, and the mom and the dad and the son, and they stayed there for a week to think whether or not they could put together a business plan to be the best distributor of wine and spirits in New York City, and they did it. So there's lots of sharing going on in those days too, and I really, really remember fondly those days. They were great.
Mm-hmm. And so thank you for bringing me these stories as we dig into the history of Calaveras wine. I mean, there's so many stories from a community building perspective, the spirit of creativity that went into this, winemaking perspective. Something I'm also very impressed with about the Calaveras Wine Region is the sharing of resources and the number of vineyard sites that you all are able to pull from on the winemaking side. And I know, Scott, you love Dalton Ranch. And what a picturesque, beautiful space in the world there in San Andreas. And so when it comes to these relationships you've all formed in the Calaveras community and the types of varietals you're able to pick and pull from, what do these relationships mean? How did those get formed, when we're talking mid 90s to early 2000s?
It was a fantastic time. These vineyards were planted with the benefit of new information that had been coming out pretty heavily over the 90s out of UC Davis and Fresno. And so all these vineyards that were installed in that period were installed with the latest concepts in canopy management and trellising and varietals and related to clones, and what the soil strata, what the dirt profile looked like. So we had all this information, and we weren't trying to retrofit vineyards. We were putting in new vineyards. So these things were going in with the newest of technology at the point in time, and there was the innovative ideas that were coming out of two of our pretty integral growers, Mark Skenfield and Steve Cullum, who were planting vineyards left and right, and so grateful that people weren't just putting these vineyards on their own, that they were actually using these two guys who were smart and interested in doing the best things that they could do, and not afraid to take some chances.
Wine country. And what would be your vision? We're talking about how Calaveras wine, mid 90s, early 2000s really started to get put on the map. And here we are now going into summer. And so what would be your vision for Calaveras wine country in the next couple of years?
I'll go first. It's funny because I'm kind of living vicariously through Scott. I'm seeing his kids getting really involved in his business. Sebastian has always worked on the crush pad, and now Sid is really getting involved in the sales and marketing portion. I would love to say that I thought my kids were also equally excited, but at 14 and 15, they want nothing to do with this. And so I would love to think that, when they get to a little bit older, like Scott's kids, that they too will see the value in living in an area like this. It's not just about winemaking, it's about where we live and all of the incredible offerings that this area has, and the community spirit is the main thing. And so my vision is just for more of the same. It's just grown in an incredibly lovely, organic manner. It is not overwhelming by any means. I know a lot of people point out that we have so many tasting rooms in town, and yet we all support each other and refer each other to people, and it doesn't seem like that much of a competition where we're being overrun by too many people. It still seems just a very lovely way of living. It's a fantastic lifestyle.
Yeah, I would agree with that. More of the same is a perfect explanation for it. I mean, we saw so much growth in the 2000s as we're kind of towards the end of this period that we're talking about. I mean, you look at some incredible things that happened locally, like in the wine business, that Twisted Oak being built and opening. That was huge for our area. There was a buzz around that for a couple of years, and it was gratifying to be a part of it. At the same time, Matt Hatcher opened his tasting room. The Zukas opened their tasting room. I mean, you could go down the list, and there, until you got to the 40 that we have now. But in terms of the future, I would say, if we organically come upon those times where we have more growth like that, then that's fantastic. But in the meantime, I think that bringing, as Chuck Hovey was so aware of in the very beginning, and did so much for Chuck for Kate and myself, I think recognizing a next generation of people that want to come into this and get involved in it is key. I'm tickled to have both my kids starting to take a pretty significant role in the company, and in the Calaveras wine industry in general. And we're seeing that elsewhere too. Like Matt Hatcher's kid Sewell is getting involved, and Kate, your kids are 14 and 15. I mean, they'll get there. Sid didn't want anything to do with this thing until about a year ago. So give them time. Don't rush them in, and give them time. But I think recognizing that next generation and taking the weight of what Chuck strapped on his back to make sure he was educating and bringing the next generation into the business, I think is about the best thing that we could do right
now. I'll briefly echo both Kate and Scott, and I think the word that comes to mind that was often used by Barden was steward, and we need to steward this ship through the next phase. And I would like to keep it growing organically like it is. We have to absorb this huge exponential growth that we've had, and steward it through the next 5 or 6 years in the fashion that it's been going up until now, and keeping in mind the vision of people like Chuck and Barden, and reflecting on the things that Kate brought up, that it's more than just a wine industry in Calaveras County. It's a lifestyle that we all cherish.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful time together. I really appreciate you taking some time out to chat with me. And, you know, that saying, home is where the heart is. And I'm hearing a lot of heart coming out of Calaveras County and the families that make up Calaveras wine country. So I wish you and your families well and look forward to our next time together. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thanks for having me.